The crypto market is roaring back to life as Bitcoin and nearly every other major Bitcoin turns green, sparking big questions about whether this surge is the start of a real comeback or just another temporary rally. Well, for more, we're joined by Oz Sultan from Sultan Interactive Group. Oz, so great to have you back as always. What is fueling this broad rebound across the global crypto market?
So if you look at what the pundits have been saying, Matty Greenspan from Quantum Economics, you've got the guys from Van Eck. A lot of them were talking about the $84,000 pressure corridor, right, which was really supposed to be a floor. It dipped a little bit below that, but that's where it kind of held. And now the market pressures are pushing everything back up. We've got about 90 of your top alts that have risen with Bitcoin. You've had a little bit of rebound inside of Ethereum, which is fantastic. And at the same point in time, your institutions are coming back in. So the big question now is, will this hold through the holidays, and will this push into some sort of market moving pressure that gets us back up into the 120s where we were a few months ago?
Okay, and you touched on altcoins there. They're showing that same momentum as well. Do you think they're going to match Bitcoin's move or just reacting to it at the moment?
I think it's all ships must rise with the biggest ship. So here, as Bitcoin pulls and it buoys the Ethereum markets, a lot of these altcoins which are pegged, or not pegged per se, but they're ERC20s that are split off of the Ethereum blockchain. They're rising as well in value. Now, is that going to hold? That's a bigger question, right? Alts typically perform in line with Bitcoin, with Ethereum, with the exception of, when you've got rugs and other weird things in the market, which you tend to have with some of these alts.
Absolutely, yeah. There's always every kind of flavor of life in these alt markets. Let's talk about rising bond yields, macro uncertainty. Is that putting any pressure on this rally as well?
Potentially, what's interesting is that the Fed has identified that starting in January, they're going to start buying back $45 billion worth of debt, federal debt for the United States on a monthly basis. So you're looking over the course of next year, really buoying down the debt over, a half a trillion dollars. Within just that short period of time. If that kind of continues, what we're looking at is, removing at least $1 trillion within the next 24 months of debt. That is bound to send, I can't even talk today, bond markets, back into a healthy position. And I also think that now that you're getting into, a bunch of Eurozone questions on what is to be done with Euro policy, the bonds can be a stronger market than some of your Forex trade markets that other folks are looking at.
Okay, and how about this renewed interest from institutional organizations in Bitcoin right now? What do you think is driving that?
The institutional push, I think, is largely driven by the fact that you've got a number of institutions that liquidated their positions when Bitcoin was on a downswing. And now you've got a lot of your ETFs as well as other big banking players that are looking to say, hey, we obviously have a foothold inside of this. Where do we go next? And what can we do from an institutional perspective? So there's a little bit of circling the wagons, I think, on the ETF side, but on the opposite side of this, there's more than likely to be some longs put out by banking institutions, as well as additional acquisitions to portfolios of just Bitcoin as a standard asset.
Yes, all right, and let's move on to our next topic. Now, Thailand and Cambodia are back on a knife's edge as deadly clashes flare up their long disputed border. Oz, love your thoughts on this. What's triggered this recent tension?
Well, a lot of this goes back to the problem of France. And, it's almost like saying Marsha, 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 except you're saying France, France, France. Some of the borders that you have in between Thailand and Cambodia weren't fully demarcated. So they're what they call white zones. And there was a Kuala Lumpur Accord that was drafted up and struck on the 26th of October. Since then, there's been a lot of back and forth. There was supposedly an incursion that happened on the border. Airstrikes were mounted. You've now had pullback in terms of citizenry that's living near that border, and a maritime situation that is now posing to continue to get inflamed. I think that the opportunity now is for this to be sort of mitigated. But the question is by whom? I believe State Department is probably going to get themselves involved in some sort of a meaningful way. Um, Sort of above and beyond that, there's the bigger question of, if the Europeans are really playing a hand in diplomacy, and we haven't really seen them at the table in the past few months. So I think that's probably what's going to be the trajectory that we're looking at now. But for now, continuing increasing flaring tensions inside of the arena, largely about the demarcation of borders and, what constitutes an incursion.
Yes, and you talked about screaming Marsha, Marsha, Marsha before. Why is it that Thailand and Cambodia are blaming each other for this escalation?
Well, if after World War II and, after the Europeans had to give all of their toys back, which was basically all the land that they had from colonial conquests, you had many of these borders that were kind of defined as white zones. And so now, where resources are becoming scarce, where the value of land is becoming more important, where there's questions about, the utilization of these things, the borders themselves are becoming far more interesting. And I think for both Thailand and Cambodia, and we saw this with Cambodia and Laos earlier this year, right? The border issue is going to continue to be something that needs to be finally meted out. What they'll finally get to is probably going to require a bunch of cartographers, a bunch of statesmen, and a bunch of time. And the question is, when will they get to that argument? I think potentially in Q1 of next year, but we don't see a quick solution to this right now, and it's going to require the redrawing of some maps, and that always takes a bit of time.
And speaking of redrawing of maps, how concerned should those neighbouring countries be within that region?
Potentially reasonably concerned, because Laos and Cambodia have had a tit-a-tat going back and forth. At the same point in time, Cambodia and Thailand have had, this tit-a-tat going back and forth, obviously with far more bloodshed inside of this one. It's really, I think, coming back to definition of what are the lines of demarcation. And then also with the more looming threats inside of the overall region from China, from the China-Taiwan conflict, there's always, I think, more of an interest in making sure that they've got their regional security kind of locked in. Borders make a huge portion of that.
Yes, certainly. And let's move on to our last topic for today. Now, we're unpacking that escalating battle between Warner Brothers and Netflix, and now Paramount launching a shock $108 billion hostile bid to derail Netflix's deal. Oz, what are your thoughts on this latest development?
At some point, this just gets back to cable. We went to all these streaming services. They're now acquiring one another. At some point, this is going to be cable again, except it's a streaming service. I think that's kind of the joke here. But this is going to face a strict amount of FTC regulation. There's antitrust concerns. You've got several senators that have been popping out and saying, no, we're not in favor of this. But at the same point in time, Hollywood is really sort of skittish. Netflix themselves have re-entrenched to move away from Hollywood. They bought a military base in Monmouth, New Jersey. They're planning a massive $900 million to several $billion movie enterprise over there. And there's big shifts, I think, in terms of the human capital that are going in. So everyone, I think, in Hollywood is worried about this one because you see consolidation, you see downsizing potentially of studios, and then you see limited or reduced opportunities when, the big question of AI and new actor talent comes to bear. So this one is probably going to get tied up in Q1 and Q2 of next year. It may happen, but I'm a little bit cautious on this one instead of being as optimistic as I might be, simply because the consolidation over the past couple of years has just been too much.
Yes, it's I just hope that cinemas don't die. That's my only saving grace for this whole thing.
Everyone hopes that.
Please leave the cinemas alone. Let us go to them. Oz, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Right here on Ticket.
You're welcome. Speak soon.